Got it. Well, hello again, everybody. Here we are.
Here we
It's
are.
about 30 minutes later. Indeed, we have Jessie back with us. We are here on Soulutions with Aquarius Rising Africa, where we really talk about the healing journey, solutions to what's been going on. The world is a crazy place currently as we know it. I don't think it's any crazier than what it's been in the past 50 or 100 years. It's just that now we're getting to see it and we're getting to experience it, and our eyes are open, and we are speaking to amazing men and women like our beautiful Jessie, who's pretty much been in the Illuminati system her whole life. So I'm very grateful that you've agreed to talk to us about that part of the system, because I think those of us who have families, parents that have not been in the system, that have grown up with, in normal, loving families, where we all have our issues, but I think it can be only horrifying to imagine that you're taken into the system by your family, and that your maybe parents, grandparents, whatever, have also been in the system. So also a product of that abuse, giving birth to children who, and probably really have no knowledge of what it is like, no role model to raise a child in a loving environment. So I would like to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, as much as what you can, and obviously what you're comfortable with, because we've been asked a lot over the past year and a half since we've been interviewing you. Your parents, when you were taken in by your proctor, you've mentioned before your mum as well was a product of the system.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about your early life regarding that, just the memories you have of your family per se, and how the heck did you survive that family experience?
Yeah, it's solely by the grace of God that I survived. It definitely was, an ongoing daily challenge, and it wasn't just one or two events a day. Literally it was living in that crisis every moment of every day, night and day for, at that time it was 4 straight years. So there were a lot of dynamics with it. One of the hardest dynamics to live with is that code of silence, that there's so many threats, and you witness that the individuals who, are the perpetrators, they have the power, they have the means to be able to, see those threats through. So everything is, really a game of chance. It's always a 50-50 chance that they may choose to follow through on those threats, even if you're doing everything that they want you to do. And that's a really hard space to be in, because there is no guarantee. You can do absolutely everything that they tell you have to do, and you still have no guarantee that anybody, including yourself, is going to be safe or kept alive. So, that constant threat of death is always over you. And that can be really hard to cope through. And, I saw a lot of survivors like me that came from high-level families. One of the ways that they deal with that is by embracing, sadness, and to the extent that they allow that sadness to overrule everything in their lives, they end up going through very dark times, and that will lead to, high levels of depression and anxiety that then lead to suicidal ideation. Seeing that as a kid, I stayed as far away from sadness as I could, because I saw where it led, and I didn't want to go down that path, solely because I did not want to give the enemy the pleasure of, breaking me to the point where I took my own life. I was like, oh, heck no, I'm not going to give him that pleasure. So, so with that said, I embraced the other strong emotion, which was anger. And so that, that emotion made me feel like I had more control in the situation. And with that anger came mischievousness, which then made me feel like I was getting some sort of justice through the situation. But, it was really hard. There were things, I had to be very aware. I had to always be on high alert. I had to know patterns, like recognize patterns, so that I could predict ahead of time, when some of those moments where I was more in danger would be. So, having younger siblings and cousins that would also be present, I always knew exactly where the other kids were. I knew exactly how long it would take me to get to them if I saw my proctor or others starting to do certain things, that then I knew what would come next. So I would always be preparing, making plans, assessing a situation in the room. I always knew, how far away were we from different doors or exits, like if we had to run outside. And things would be so quick, like, one of the things I would always do walking into a room, I would make sure that every single sharp object was put away in a drawer, because that would, afford us more time. My family, on we'll say the bad side, that was their favorite thing, was to use sharp objects. They would do things like pretending like they were going to be sewing or fixing stuff up. So then, it would be common for them to have a pair of scissors out. So, if I walked into a room, those were the first things that went away. There were times I would even hide them, but I would get in trouble for that. So I had to kind of be more clever and just put it away somewhere, and know that if I heard a drawer opening, that meant I needed to grab the babies and run, outside, and be somewhere in the open space. We had a huge vent in the walls in one of our houses, like an air duct vent. And so, I knew how to place it just right so that those screws were not screwed in, but looked like everything was in place, so that if we had to, that was another cubby hole, so we didn't get trapped upstairs. We could hide in there. But there were times where I was fighting, where we were being attacked while we were in that cubby hole, until, the psychosis was done. For me, one of
just to be clear, if you don't mind, just to be clear with the viewers, this was really for you to be protecting and defending yourself against, as you say, when your abusers, there were obviously more than one, were coming down from their adreno trip, I don't know what you call it, and then, as you say, going into the psychosis, where they would then go a little bit crazy and start chasing you around with knives and scissors and sharp objects. And you pretty much had to be on high alert to protect yourselves, your siblings as well, your little friends. So,
and so there were different things I was dealing with. Some of it, was psychosis, when they're coming down, or even they're in that act of psychosis from, the formaldehyde and pineal gland hormones, that it was a hybrid mixture that they would take with alcohol. So that was one part. And then you also had the demonic part where, you know, they would have the spirits that would come and torment them, or, you know, seduce them to do certain things, or at times possess them. And so sometimes it was, you know, not just dealing with a person, you're dealing with whatever demonic spirit is possessing them at that moment. And then there were times where, you know, it just seemed like pure mental illness, where, you know, they didn't have any extra alcohol or any inducers, yet it was part of their upbringing or programming, you know. So it just depended on the situation. So, you know, for them, there were, you know, they literally would train in the abuse, and part of the grooming process with my younger cousins or siblings. And, you know, that there would be narrative that would go along with it, that, you know, it'd be things like, you know, a good mother does this, or a good mother does whatever, you know. And so, you know, my own mom, sometimes that programming would come up, and, you know, she would hear in her head, you know, like a good mother gives their toddler enemas. You know, well, where did that come from? That was generationally passed on. That was part of their grooming process for some of the children. So she would hear those things, but then she would stop and she would say, but, you know, my child doesn't have any issues. You know, why would I need to do this? I don't need to do it. You know, they have healthy bowels. And so she would make that choice to not go along with what she had been taught. You know, so some of it was just that predictive stuff that you were dealing with. And sometimes, you know, it was flashbacks that you're dealing with, where, you know, they would go into memories themselves or flashbacks. And then as a kid, having to discern, okay, is this a demon that I'm dealing with? You know, when they're saying odd things, they're saying things that are out of context, they're, you know, not in their right mind. You can't really, you know, talk or reason with them. So what do you do in that type of situation? How do you wade through the flashback with them without, you know, having yourself or your siblings in direct danger? So
Can I ask you here? You've spoken to us in the past about pretty much your parents being drugged, hypnotized, whatever means they were using to knock them out at a certain time in the evening, where you were then taken by your proctor and had your training then.
Right.
Were there times that either your mom or your dad noticed something was not right with you? Were there any signs for your parents to see that something was going on? Was there ever any sign for you? And I guess what I'm asking you is, at what point did you realize that your mom and your dad were not able to be your protectors at that time?
Yeah, I realized that, you know, straight from the beginning, that there was no way that they could protect or provide me with any safety during that. You know, as to, you know, any signs or any notice that things were not right, absolutely not. You know, my posture was perfect in every way. So there were no signs or indicators that anything was wrong. You know, even in relation to, you know, my direct abusers, there was always that outward appearance that the relationship was very loving, that, we were always present together with, that family relationship that was very good. I was very social with everybody who, was part of that. And, we just always displayed this perfect posture. So it wasn't until I got out that's when things started to kind of manifest, because I was out and they had no direct contact with me yet. We lived not even 5 minutes away from a sanctuary that was kind of like Bohemian Grove, where they would gather and the witches would gather. And so all night long, I'd be getting astral projections and attacks from these witches. They'd be trying to drag me back in. And so, my mother had noticed that, and, I was still only getting like 3 hours of sleep a night. And, when she would ask me what was wrong, I would say, well, can't you hear the witches? And so for her mind went straight to, oh, Jessie's hearing voices. Maybe we need to get you some mental health. And it was like, it's not in my head. Like, these witches are real. Go 5 miles down the road and you're going to see them with their candles lit up, So it was where, she had to start recognizing that the attacks were not just spiritual, but that there was physical things happening as well. And so the Lord started to open her eyes to the reality, and it was at that point that, one night she heard me and one of my siblings talking about, the ritual wall. And she was like, wait a second, like, did you hear my dream? Like, was I talking about that in my dream out loud? And it was like, no, this is a real place. And then she said, well, do you know where it's at? And I said, oh yeah, it's, and I gave her the location. And then that was when she had to sit down, and she was like, I thought that it was all in my head. I thought I was just having dreams of these places, but you're telling me they're real and you've been there? And I'm describing things that she's dreamed about. And, so what's interesting is that even some of the family who is in the system, like when she was talking to some of them, they would be like, oh, Jessie heard your dreams, or, and she's like claiming it as her own. So that's part of how they tried to discredit as well. But it was like, no, like, I'm the one who gave the name of the exact location and, the demographics of these places. So, so that would be interesting too, is that the family would try to convince her that I was stealing her memories or stealing her nightmares and talking about them.
How did these type of conversations come up? Because from what I understand, your mum was also in the system, right?
At very, very young age, she experienced things, but not like, she wasn't involved in her adult years at all. Like, she fled at age 18 and joined the military, and that's where she married my father.
Okay.
So.
How was it for you? Because she would have been mind controlled, right? Even if she was just involved for a short while or whatever, they would have definitely tampered with her memories and done some kind of programming on it. How old were you when you recognized that? And what was it for you like as a child, growing up with knowing that she could not protect you?
It wasn't just the protection. She really started to have that programming start to break down, where she was getting memories and flashbacks. And that started around that time when I was going through stuff. So it made it really hard for her to function in her role as mom. Now, I'm not saying, she definitely was not a bad mother. She more, the relationship, instead of, feeling like I had a mother and I was the daughter, I was kind of the one who had to fill in that role as a mom, and even that included for her as well. And, she, was learning how to cope and function through that horrific abuse that she had experienced. So we were really like best friends, like we always had that relationship where we did everything together as a team. And that was kind of my coping skill. Like I found that if I just expected her to do it, it wouldn't get done because she didn't know what to exactly do. So it's like, I grew up with things very regimented, where meals were, you always had your breakfast, lunch, dinner, the little ones need snacks here or there. So, it helped me to be very, or I guess I'll just say I was very scheduled from the training that I went through, because you had, with that 24-hour training, everything was very, very scheduled. So I was used to that schedule. So that's what I brought into the home. My father was a truck driver, so long distance truck driver. So he was gone throughout the week. He'd be home on the weekends. So really, I had to manage the home according to the schedule that I had learned for things to go well. If I didn't do something, it just, my mother couldn't make it get done. I mean, she tried, but she just couldn't make it get done. So, I was kind of the one that held the home together and took care of the siblings. It's like, if the baby was crying, why is he crying? Does he need a diaper change? Is he hungry? How do we get that done? I cooked, I cleaned, I did all that starting at age 6. And, when my dad would get home, he'd have everything prepared and set up around his chair. I knew which his favorite potato chips, his Mountain Dew. So he just had to come home, sit down, take his boots off, and sit there and watch TV and relax. But part of that too is, my father had a lot of anger issues that he was dealing with. And so that was part of the way that I could keep peace in the home, was just to make sure that everything was in order and in place. So with that, my mother also was having a lot of complications with severe migraines. So a lot of times she'd be laying in bed, having her flashbacks and dealing with all of that together, but still the home was managed and normal as it could be for me and my siblings, in between all of that.
Your father, he had no idea that your mum had been in the system.
No.
It's not like he was in the system or came from another bloodline family.
Right, no, yeah, he was he is bloodline, but didn't know. And that family line connection was, was silent. So, nobody on his side was aware of that. And, just, they were big time fishermen. I call them, kind of the good old Hardy Boys type feel. They were just very relational men. You'd sit down at a meal and all the guys would be together talking. That side of the family, a lot of men. So I had a lot of boy cousins. And we, just built a lot of close relationships with the men. They were all very safe for me. So they were like my best friends. And, my youngest years before my training started, I did a lot of outdoors activities with them. So, it was with those cousins, we got into the tree climbing, the fishing, I did the bug hunts on top of all that. But very outdoorsy, a lot of camping, stuff like that. Even, my mom's side, We had a lot with the sailing, so a lot of outdoor activity on the water. And they were big hunters, fishers also. So the men were often engaged in those type of activities and stuff. So, it kind of was a huge dynamic, but I always had to be prepared for those things, that were coming, even throughout the night. I was afforded 3 hours to sleep, usually from 2 a.m. to 6, or 3 to 6. And, but I still had to, be preparatory, because it wasn't always guaranteed that my proctor wasn't going to get up and try something in the night. So there were things that I would do, like put, like sometimes they wouldn't allow me to close my bedroom door. So I would do things like, put books that were bent so they couldn't necessarily be seen. But if the door opened any further, they would fall, and that would make the noise to wake me up. Or they had those floor rugs that when you turned over, they had all the prickly things. And my proctor would always be walking around barefoot. So, those prickly carpets afforded me quite a bit of time. So I would always be turning those over in front of the doorways. And then, if she stepped on those, you'd always hear her yelping and crying because her feet were so sensitive, but it would give me time to get ready, to prepare for the attack, whatever was coming. But yeah, then I would do, spiritual things to try to get that, because then, when she would figure out my attacks or my preparatory things, she would find other ways to attack. So, then I'd get like the levitating and the astral projection into my room, at night. So I'd have to, find all sorts of ways to protect against that as well for me and my siblings. So
that's quite a responsibility that you took on at such a young age, obviously. Recognizing, I know from our previous interviews, and one of the first things I heard was the first experience you really had was when she took you to the ceremony, I guess that was, where she decapitated.
Took the life of the former Queen Mother of Darkness, and
that was basically you being told, you say a word and the rest, that'll happen to the rest of your family. I'm interested to know, so obviously your mum then, when her memories started breaking down, or she started recovering her memories and stuff like that, I know just from speaking to so many overcomers what a traumatic experience that can be, for sure. Mm-hmm. At what point did she find out that you had been taken in? And I'm not sure if your siblings as well, but let's just, if you had been taken in, and what was her reaction when she found out what had been
that was
going
at age 10. That was at age 10. So at that point, she attempted to call the police. But the Madison police told her, basically to shut her mouth, and that if she brought anything forward or tried to pursue it, that we'd find ourselves in a very dangerous position. So she was threatened. From there, there were a couple pastors that she tried to tell, but they didn't have any authority or ability to do anything with it. So then, we had some incidences like where, me and my sister and a friend were followed home from school. And so when we turned that in, because of who was following us, they actually had Ted Gunderson come and investigate. So that was the first time I got to talk with him, was at age 10. And from there, there actually was a council meeting afterwards because Ted had to turn all of his information into John McCain. And so then the council met because they realized that, that if afforded the opportunity, I would share everything. So they were trying to decide, what do they do? Because I was chosen for this high position. Everything was already in place. I was fully trained for the end time rituals that they had in place. And yet they knew that I definitely was not for them, and that, I would never stop trying to tell, no matter what the consequences were. So, they had a lot of meetings and attempted to, like, I'll just say Lucifer did not allow them, and above all, it was God in his sovereignty who did not give them the permission to end my life. So with that, they had to find ways to maneuver, how do they navigate that challenge of me constantly trying to tell and come against them? How do they keep the system going when I'm trying to tear it down? So, yeah, so, my mom did come alongside of me in that, there was a lot of prayer. We would get direct attacks from witches. We had one of my bus drivers actually was a witch, and she used to, every night, she would come on the sidewalk in front of our house and be doing rituals right there in front of our house. So the Lord really brought us together in prayer and reading the word and proclaiming the word to overcome some of those attacks. And she didn't have all the pieces or all the memories, but she believed she had enough memories of her own to believe what I was saying. And, the Lord had equipped me in spiritual warfare. So, she was a strong advocate in going forward in that spiritual warfare with me.
Was she surprised at all when she heard?
I think at first the biggest shock for her was her entire life. Her family had convinced her that she was crazy and that all that stuff was just, in her head, that she was mentally ill. So to find out, for the first time that you're none of those things, that, that you've been suppressed as somebody who brought forward truth, I think that was very shocking for her. Her entire life. Yeah.
Imagine.
That must have been quite something. And your dad, what does he have to say about all of this? Did he find out? Does he know? Did he know?
Yeah, I don't know if he knows yet or not, but I'm pretty sure a lot of it's gonna come forward. We have talked about some of it. I've let him know, not like full details of stories, but let him know that that my testimony has gone to federal levels. So he knows pieces, and he actually is a very strong supporter of my ministry, my books and stuff like that. So I'm pretty sure he's heard more by now, but it's not something we actively talk about. So.
Then my next question goes to, my next line of questioning would go to Jessie as a mom. Now, obviously, with you having been through so much, literally taking responsibility for your entire family at the age of 6, taking care of your dad and his moods, taking care of your mum, and obviously what she was going through, your siblings, what they were going through. Wow, quite something. And really just knowing that this is not just a little girl trying to be motherly. This is a little girl fighting for the life of her family and having to do so with the utmost posture. You know, that in itself, I think, is something so mammoth. So fast forward a few years, and now you marry and you have children of your own. And I think what you've also mentioned in previous interviews is that it's very hard for you to feel emotion, you know, because of the posture you've been taught and of the horrors you've seen. How was it for you as a mom raising your children in what could also be this potentially very dangerous environment, having your wits about you, knowing that you weren't being hypnotized or sleeping pulled up, or drugged up, rather, whichever methods they use, and that your children weren't being taken in and abused in a similar way to what you were. And the next level of my question around that, or the next layer rather of my question around that, would be, how was it for you being a mom, having experienced all that you did as a little girl, and still being okay with your children, just feeling okay that they're safe, that God's got this?
Yeah, there was a lot of growth that had to happen in those areas, you know, because it's a challenge and a struggle, and you're wrestling against so many things. The biggest thing is, you know, the attacks the enemy will send in your areas where you're very insecure. So, you know, for me, having a child automatically put me in that insecure place, yet where I have to be really responsible. But, you know, that all of the things that I had learned as a child, you know, I had to throw those coping skills out the window. You know, some of them I still struggle with, because it was just, that was the only way I could cope with the depth of the trauma. So one of the things, you know, emotionally, you know, every relationship I built was very devoid of any emotional depth. And, you know, that was a protection mechanism. So, you know, at first it was like, you know, I had learned that kind of, I'm trying to think the right word for it. For me, to show love just meant you were together, you're in the same place. So, you know, those little babies never left my side when they were little. It was like they were always right there, right next to me. Whatever I did, they were doing too. You know, there might have been a few hours when I was at work where I entrusted them to my spouse, but it was like, otherwise, you know, they were always with me, where I had eyes on, or I could feel them. You know, even some of the things, you know, from when I was a kid, you know, my training partner, when we were in the dark or having to battle or combat, he would always say, hold the bottom of my shirt, and he would hold mine. So that naturally, to me, like when we were out and about, and, you know, by then I had 4 kids, you know, I would always say to the older 2, you know, hold on to the bottom of my shirt. And then I just knew that they were right there wherever I was going. But with that, you know, then the Lord started to work in me that I needed to build that emotional depth. And, you know, there was so much fear in that. And the base of that fear was addressing the lack of trust in myself. That, you know, my biggest fear as a kid was always that there was something the enemy could do that where I would have no control over myself. And I knew the depths of what I was capable of. So I had this huge fear of, you know, that I would cause harm or death to others. So that was a huge thing that had to be broken. And it started kind of in one of those early wounds I know I've talked about, you know, at Gloria Vanderbilt's, that, you know, one of the first murders I witnessed was when, you know, a baby was delivered to Gloria's, and my proctor took me in the bathroom and basically drowned the baby. So imagine being a mom and now you're all by yourself. There's nobody else there and you're alone with this baby and you've got to give him a bath, you know? And I was just terrified, you know, that like I had to work through all those flashbacks. I had to tell myself, you know, I love this little one. I would never do anything to hurt them. But then beyond telling myself, I had to get to the point where I fully believed it and felt comfortable trusting myself. So, you know, I love, you know, that's pretty much where my prayer time and my safe place had been. So the enemy was trying to come in and take that safe place from me with those flashbacks and memories. So, you know, one of the things I would do is, you know, I'd ended up with all my kids eventually, but I said, I'm going to make this still my safe place. And so, you know, I'd be filling up that bathtub with water and steam, and I'd bring him in there in the baby bath, you know, on the side. And I would just be praying, reading my Bible, singing songs to the Lord. And that became kind of our peaceful, quiet time every night. And eventually I had like all 6 of those little ones in there, you know, where we're all sitting on the floor reading our Bibles and praising the Lord. And then after, you know, we would take our baths and stuff, but that I had to go through all of that to make it feel like a safe place, because I would be so tormented with all the horrific memories. And then even, you know, the eye contact is still something that I greatly struggle with because, you know, it was so misused when I was growing up that, you know, I would see the evil, and with that, you know, see the evil thoughts that people were putting out. So, you know, I grew up not giving any eye contact at all. That was the way I protected myself from seeing the evil inclinations in people's hearts. And so, you know, to be able to sit there and engage for more than a couple seconds in eye contact with these little ones, or to really appreciate them, you know, like to just, I grew up in a world where there was no touch. So to be able to just, you know, stroke their head or their face and say loving things to them, I didn't grow up with that. So that was a huge challenge for me, was to build that physical spiritual contact. You know, the community engagement was easier for me. So, you know, even when they were young, I constantly was out ministering in the communities, on the streets. You know, they'd be right alongside of me. You know, we got involved with a lot of stuff with homeless people. I never, you know, my kids were never afraid to be on the streets, even if somebody was drunk or even if it was somebody who had a spirit in them. You know, my kids were able to recognize that, and they weren't afraid to just love that person. There were moments I was afraid for them. You know, one of my younger sons, when we moved into one of our places, the neighbor across the street was a strong alcoholic, and you know, he would totally be drunk and he'd have a big bottle of tequila in one hand, a bottle of whiskey in the other, and you know, he'd be shouting out across the street. The first thing my little guy does, he's 5 years old, he runs across the street, jumps in that guy's arms and gives him this big hug. And I'm sitting there like, like we don't even know if he's a pedophile, right? Like, and the Lord stopped me. Like I was going to go grab him out of our neighbor's arms. And the Lord stopped me and he said, look at that man's face. And he was laughing and just like holding my little boy. And the Lord said, he's never known love. And I was like, okay, Lord, not my will, but yours be done. You know, but things like that, you know, I did have to put up boundaries with that neighbor and say, you know, if you're drinking, if you got alcohol in your hands, you stay on your side of the street. You're not allowed to come into my yard, you know, which he always was respectful of. But What was interesting is that neighbor ended up, like 3 years later, he committed suicide. But my little boy was the only one to ever really show him an abundance of love, you know? So very interesting that the Lord allowed that in his last 3 years, to have this little kid that was always happy to see him, always saying, "Hey, how are you doing, Dave?" You know, "How's
Wow.
your day going?" He would yell at him and across the street, you know, because Dave couldn't come over. Uh, but it was funny just the way that God tried to win Dave's heart, you know, and
Wow.
he gave him that opportunity through one little boy, you know?
And I think what's so important to recognize about that is that, when people have got these addictions, call it that, in their lives, whether it's alcohol or drugs or whatever, work or sex or pornography or whatever, it really is coming from such a place of emptiness, of lack of, not having. So to have your little guy go there and show him love for the first time in his life must have meant so much to him. So you've obviously been aware that because of where you were lacking, or what, in your childhood, it was so important to give your children.
Mhm.
So I think there are many people out there at the moment who haven't necessarily been through what you've been through, or even to the extent that you've had it, but maybe other parents other people who've grown up with alcoholic parents or been sexually violated or abused in any way. We tend to either become the perpetrator,
Mhm.
or we go to the opposite extreme of that and maybe can be quite anal about stuff. So what would
Yeah.
you recommend parents?
Well, yeah, it's letting go of your fears and trusting the Lord and learning to equip rather than cage in. Our tendency is that we want to cage in order to protect, but we have to get rid of that caging in, because with that caging in, the auto response of those who are being caged in is to rebel and go right into those things that we're trying to protect them against. So it's better to try to prepare and equip and be honest, you know. I didn't go into great depths of my story with my kids, but they all know enough, where they knew who the people who were not safe are. They knew that it was connected to satanic ritual abuse. Um, they knew some of the things like, how do you deal with nightmares if you're getting attacked that way? How do you deal with people if they approach you? What is your authority in Christ? Because sometimes, or I'll say that is really the only way to address these things is through prayer and through our authority in Christ. But I also had to navigate some of those things. I think, for some of us, the challenge is that our spouses aren't always on board. So, I had my former spouse was very anti, I'll say anti the truth. Like he was fully aware that I came from an occultic background, but he never wanted to hear the story. So that made it hard to live in that family because you're still dealing with that silence. You can't fully be you. You can't fully be free because you're still not able to fully share who you are. So if you're a spouse, that would be my first encouragement. That can be the greatest ministry to a survivor, is taking the time to hear, about their trauma, and that will help you to work through it. Some of the stuff is hard to believe, but those are things that you can pray through, or even doing counseling together. That can sometimes be the greatest avenue, whether it's a pastor or a authentic counselor. just being willing to go through that so that, you know, you're working through that healing process together. That can be the greatest gift you can give a spouse who is a survivor, and give to your children and your family. The second thing is, you know, navigating through those flashbacks or nightmares. You know, I've got my kids, I'll still have moments. They're far less than when I was a child. You know, I used to have nightmares all the time. And, you know, not just graphic ones, but literally where I'm getting spiritually attacked in my sleep. And, you know, I would get to the point where I can't wake myself up from it. So to compensate for that issue, you know, I can't, like, I'll get the paralysis where I can't speak fully, but I got enough where I can make enough of a loud enough noise that now my kids know if I'm making that noise, you know, they need to wake me up, physically wake me up and pull me out of that
So
nightmare.
it's really about communication, because I think
Yeah.
I think what I'm hearing you say as well is that it is so important to be authentic and honest. And obviously,
Yeah.
we don't want to traumatize our children to the next level by telling them all the graphic details. But it's
Yeah.
like what you're saying is to make them aware of what's going on. And, you know, how do they deal with nightmares? How do they deal with attacks? Because also what I'm hearing a lot is that if there has been a parent or both parents that even they might not be actively involved in the system anymore, they might have come out of it, or but there are still certain doors that are open, and very often these doors will open, these spiritual doors will open, and then these demonics will literally go for one or more of the children. So at what age would you suggest that parents start speaking to their children about this, and what do you tell them? What would the opening conversation around something like this be?
I started as odd as it sounds, but I started when they were infants. So I would say things in my prayers over them, you know, where it's like, you know, you don't belong to the evil one. Even though our family comes from a long line that served the evil one, you belong to the Lord Jesus Christ. And I've chosen, you know, to be out. I don't worship Lucifer. I choose Jesus Christ alone. So I would pray those things over them, and that continued, you know, as they get into the toddler years. Then I would say things to them that, you know, you have a choice you have to make. You know, our family, you know, come from these lines of serving the enemy. Uh, they actively engage in witchcraft, and I would name that type of witchcraft so my kids knew. You know, if I saw things out and about like tarot cards, I would say these are tarot cards, or this is a Ouija board. They use this to communicate with spirits. You want to stay away from this. You know, we pray, we talk directly to the Lord, we read scripture. So I would direct them through those things, even at those young ages, and they do understand. You know, one of the cutest stories, my oldest son, you know, usually all the, you know, we'd have one or two lights on at night, but all the doors usually would be left open. So one night I got up and the bathroom door was shut. And I was like, huh, what's up with that? The bathroom door shut. Well, when I opened it up, he was sitting in there reading his Bible. And I said, you know, oh, what are you doing? You know, is everything okay? And he was just like, oh, I had bad dreams. And so he went in there when he had the bad dream. He went into the bathroom, which was our safe spot, and he opened up his scriptures and he started reading, looking through the pictures, reading his Bible to help combat that fear. You know, so they get it at that young age. If you teach them what to do, they
I
will.
love
You
what
will
you
see them doing
said.
it.
I love what you said, that from when they were infants, maybe even in the womb already, you know, start having that
Yep.
conversation with them, and start, you know, and start communicating with them, because we know that they understand us. We know that there's not even a question.
Yeah.
the language of God that we speak, I think, when we have these kind of conversations with the little ones. So already from their conception and being a little fetus, they would understand that they belong to God and that there was nothing to be fearful of. That even though the bloodline on a physical level dictates X, Y, and Z, you've broken that. They are no longer part of that. And that is.
And part of the self-talk with them too, I did a lot of that where it was like, I would express my feelings to them. So some of it had to come through songs, as silly as it seems. But one of my favorites, was Turn Around Bright Eyes. And for me, that song was about the eye contact. And as I would sing it to my, my daughter, who was the oldest child, I would say, I want to be able to look you in the eyes. And when I do, I want you to see back that, every thought in my heart towards you is good, that I never want to hurt you, not even unintentionally. I want you to know how much I love you. And these are the ways I'm going to show you that I love you. Some of that, came through gentle touch, where it's like, I want you to know that when I touch the top of your head and I stroke your hair, that I love you, or even doing her hair. She was a little pain. She'd sit there and let me curl her little hair all up, right? And then the moment I got it all up and it was all fancy and done, she would be like, eh! And she'd rip it all out because she was a tomboy, right? So just like I was, but
just like mama.
Right? So it was funny. But some of that we have to talk ourselves through and ask the Lord for help, and not let those fearful things become a challenge, so it is hard.
Did you find I asked you earlier on about being a mom and having not experienced that emotional connection to your mom and your grandma and what have you as a little kid, which I think is a very natural thing. I mean, if I just look in my family, we were also 6 kids and fought until the roof sometimes did that, but we always knew that we loved each other,
Yeah.
And it's a natural thing to have a mom and a dad who would hug you and put you on their lap and throw you up and tickle you and play games with you and, do horsey rides with you and, whatever. So I think that would have been something that you no doubt would have missed out on.
Yeah.
So did you find that when you, because of your consciousness, when you had your babies and you consciously chose to, as you say to your daughter, when I look at you in your eyes, know that there's only good thoughts and love coming from my heart. When I touch you on your head, I want you to know that I love you. When I hug you, I want you to know that that's my promise. I will never let you down, or whatever the case might be. Did you find that was your healing as well?
It was my healing. What was interesting is that, my daughter was a lot like me, where, she preferred to kind of be distant. She was closer, navigated, towards that relationship with her dad. She was a daddy's girl. So, it was like you're trying to like reach out and get that healing and have that connection. And yet, what she desires is something else. The same thing I desired as a kid, where I navigated towards the men, because that's what I felt safer with. So it was interesting because I had to come to that place of like, okay, well, she knows, and I just have to accept that. She even had her pediatrician. It was really funny because when I would take her to her pediatrician would walk with her throughout the entire office, handing her off to everybody. And she'd be like, she's like, I've never seen this, the baby that has no separation anxiety. So that was what it did, was that you know, it made her feel so safe that she didn't feel like she had to have that clingy relationship with me. You know, she just knew I was always there, and she felt safe being anywhere with anybody, you know. So then I was like, you know, like for me, it was like, how do I protect her in the midst of that? But all of my kids were very, very social, like able to just build relationships with anybody. You know, not fearful, I guess I should say. They were never afraid to just be out anywhere building relationships with people. So that was what came of that. It didn't necessarily, you know, just go between me and them. They just knew I was that solid relationship that was there, and they extended emotionally outward. So that was interesting.
So that's so beautiful. It's almost like the stuff you missed as a little kid yourself was given back to you through your children all these years later. And I'm sure each and every one of your kids will have their own little personalities and do it in their own way and give you a rough time in their own way as well. So
yeah, like we had one that was a real instigator
as well.
Yeah, he was such a little bully and instigator to his brothers and that were a few years older than him. But what was funny is, you know, when we were at church in the nursery, like he'd go around, he was always gentle with babies, and he would go and kiss each one on the top of the head. And then he was also very sensitive to kids that had disabilities. So his best friend was, you know, a kid that had autism, and he was always very gentle with him. He'd literally, I mean, this was the bully in the family, right? But he'd reach out his little hand and take his friend's hand, and he'd say, come on, let's go do the swings together, you know, and he'd literally take them by the hand and they would go do stuff. So it was just funny that, you know, this little warrior inside, yet he knew, you know, those who were weaker than him, and he would be very intentionally sensitive and kind to them. So
I would love to ask you if you can just think of each of your kids right now, and if you could, without mentioning their names, if you don't want to, but what would be 2 or 3 words you would use to describe each of your kids?
Well, my oldest, you know, it was funny because anger was always a safe emotion in our household. And, you know, we were all strong fighters. So my oldest was the one that was the fighter, you know. And I can remember when she was like 2 years old, you know, I'd be trying to discipline her, and it got where, you know, I couldn't do the physical discipline. So I'd put her in a room, but she would be pulling on that door handle, screaming and yelling at me, like ready to fight me. Like, how dare you put me in my room? And, you know, I just remember even asking, where did she get this stuff? Because, you know, we didn't watch any shows. She didn't see any other kids treating their parents that way. Me and my spouse at the time didn't, like, you know, we were never negative, or we didn't yell or, you know, demote each other in front of the kids or anything. So, but she'd be sitting there yelling. She'd be like, you're such a bad mom. She was 2 years old. And I'd be like, where did she get this from, right? And I'd be like, no, it's okay. Parents can discipline their children, you know, and I'd be yelling back through the door, like, it's okay. I'm supposed to discipline you. Like, you know, like she would sometimes be really naughty. Like we had one time, like her dad was out, like we had the grill right on the porch. So he just would step out the front door and grill, but he'd also be cooking at the same time. And he'd put up a baby gate in front of the kitchen, you know, so he could go out and the kids would still be safe and stuff. But the one day she slammed the door shut and locked it. So she locked him out, and it was her and her 2-year-old brother, and he had a pot of potatoes boiling on the stove. And, she thought it was funny, and he was like, you better unlock this door. And she refused. He had to get the neighbor and had to break the door down. So it was like that. And then she still fought us. Like when we were disciplining her, she fought us in that. And I was like, no, what you did wasn't right and could have really hurt your brother, My second one was just very like too creative and ingenious for me. Like I'm not mechanical nor technical, but he would find stuff and take it all apart, figure out how it all worked, find new uses for it. So like, my spouse was pretty good about getting up early, but one day he had slept in and I got home from work and, come in, and my 2-year-old has the curling iron, which I had never used. Like it was up in a bin in the bathroom. I'd never taken it out, since he had been born. And so he had climbed up there, pulled out the bin, found it, figured out he could plug it in. So I come home and he's got tortillas wrapped around the curling iron. And I'm like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm making breakfast. It's like, you're gonna burn yourself, burn the house down, right? But he figured it out. So wow. I had to always, he was also my risk taker, still is to this day. But, constantly we had to be, watching him. And finally we got him, a skateboard, and he got into the skateboarding, and we got him into some of that stuff to get some of his risk taking, an avenue to go down.
Adventurous. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we had Josiah was the runner in the bunch, but he also very ingenuitive. He had a lot of dyslexia and reading issues, but any problem he could solve in a matter of, like, he just had to sit there for like 5 minutes and think on it, and then he could come up with a solution. But like we put up all sorts of baby gates to try to keep him in. And I'm not kidding you, like he'd sit there for 5 minutes just examining it. He'd all of a sudden go up and he'd hit it right in the right spot. The whole thing would fall apart and he'd be out the front door running. And so I had to try to keep him inside. And I was like, this kid is going to be the death of me, right? Even the church pastor, the first time it was the pastor's wife, she ran the nursery with him. And I told her, I said, he's an escape artist. Like, you literally need to have eyes on him the entire time. And she's like, oh, he'll be fine. Well, a few weeks later, she comes up to the church and she's like, okay, she's like, I've just got to share this story. She's like, we all know how Josiah likes to escape. She goes, so I yelled at him. I'm confessing I yelled at him. He was like 2 years old, right? She's like, so I told him, Josiah, your butt better not leave that chair today. And she goes, I turned around for a second. I turned back around and he's heading towards that door, carrying the chair on his butt with him. So literalist. But yeah, so then my other one, my next one, he was very quiet and reserved. And I was like, well, that's odd. Like, my first three were all extreme extroverts. And then my fourth one was just very quiet. He hardly ever talked. And one day we're driving to church. He was 5 years old. And all of a sudden I hear this little voice out of the back, just like, da, 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 da. And I thought we had, I was like, is one of the neighbor kids, did they sneak in our car this morning? And I'm like, who is that talking back there? And they're like, no, it's number 4. And I was like, wait, what? So we all laughed because that was like the day he came out of his shell. And we found out he wasn't an introvert. He was an extrovert too. He just decided to be quiet for a while.
And then it didn't stop after that.
Yep, he was an introvert after that. But yeah, they attended. My oldest two were really close. Then my second two were really close. And then I had my youngest two. My fifth one was the instigator. Still is, but he's very blunt. He was the one that we had a lot of problems with because he's always honest. This kid never lies, but it would get us into a lot of trouble. So, he's one that if there's somebody in authority, he will challenge that authority. So he would have issues where, like at school, like the kids would be doing some stuff that wasn't right. And so, he would confront them on it. And then they would be saying, teacher, he's doing this or that, he's being mean. So then he would get in trouble, and the teacher would end up taking him to the principal. And the principal would be like, you can't be mean to your classmates. And he'd be like, but they were doing this or that. And then the principal would say, well, no, they said, you were being mean to them. And that's what we have to address. We're addressing you being mean. Now his mind thinks, well, that's not the problem. The problem was that these kids were doing what was not right. And now, I'm getting in trouble because of what they were doing. And so he'd sit there and call his principal and say, you're a big fat liar, which didn't go well. And he would say, I wasn't being mean, I was being truthful. And it would cause these big issues. And, so I got called in many times because he would call this principal a big fat liar to her face. And I'd be like, well, you got to understand how this kid works. What was the problem in the first place? That's what you need to address. He's a huge justifier. So if you don't address that problem, you're not going to get anywhere until justice is served, right? So
exactly. And he understood that innately. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, he did. It was really kind of funny. And then my youngest, she was the long awaited girl in between all these boys. And, so her and her sister are really close. And she was kind of the princess in the family. And she's sitting here looking at me as I'm talking, like, that lies. No. But we had fun. What was funny is she got to be the girly tomboy. Because, both me and my oldest were tomboys and refused to wear dresses and everything. But my youngest, she liked to be dressed up and liked to be catered to. So, but it had to be kind of a girly tomboy thing. So she'd be wearing the dress plus, the Chuckies or the boots with her tights and
cute.
with her hair all done up. And, so kind of fun. But
oh, wow. Wonderful. Oh, Jessie, that is so lovely. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Love listening to that. And really grateful for, sharing about your family and what you've been through on that level. And just, I think so many people are going to be going through and currently are going through it and still will in the future, just from a mom's perspective, from a child's perspective. It really just takes love, openness and communication, I think, which can heal.
The observation, figuring out how people work best. I learned early on, and as a friend of mine, kind of put it into words for me later, don't attack people, learn how to turn that anger and whatever else into solving the problem. And, when I started looking at things that way, what is the problem? Then, you start addressing that rather than, approaching the relationship in a negative way. So, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I really, you know, with all of that, it is, as you say, approaching it with an intention to solve it. Everyone has their issues, everyone has their pains, everyone has their stories to tell. And it really just takes sensitivity, kindness, patience with each other.
Well, even, you know, I feel led to talk just a little bit more about that too. You know, it helped me to work through some of those abusive relationships by doing two things. First, you know, before the Lord, I would say, you know, Lord, this is what I want that relationship to look like. So the first thing is you have to decide, even going forward as adults, you know, do you carry on those relationships or not? You know, I knew I wanted to forgive. I didn't want, you know, there to be any unforgiveness in my heart. So I chose to forgive. But then I had to make that next choice. You know, what does that forgiveness look like? Do I carry on a relationship? If so, I need to clearly define for myself, what is that relationship going to look like? What are the boundaries that I'm going to put into place? And how do I enforce those boundaries? So, you know, for me, it was important to continue the relationship because in the end, I wanted them to come to the Lord. So how do I do that in a safe way, even with my kids? You know, did I want, you know, my abusers to have relationships with my children? I did. But then there had to be the definite boundaries. You know, one was that they were never allowed to be alone with them. Everything happened when we were together. Number two, you know, I usually watched, I'd either bring my own food or, you know, I'd be very careful about the food because of the drugging things that happened when I was a kid. So usually it'd be meeting at a random restaurant, you know, that was my pick, and we would all go together. And, you know, that was a way I could ensure that there wasn't going to be drugging or things like that. I'd have to watch, you know, drinks. You know, I would never let them serve me something. So, you know, little things like that, you know, saying, okay, like, how do I want this relationship to look like? And, you know, then going even farther, you know, writing letters, you know, acknowledging the abuse and saying, okay, like, let's be real here. There's things that we can't outright mention that we both are aware of, you know, that you did that hurt me. But I want you to know that I forgive you. And, you know, I want to have a relationship. One of those letters, you know, I wanted to go a step farther where it was like, Lord, I want one good thing to be thankful for this person in my life, you know, and that was the hardest thing. It was like, God, I have absolutely nothing to be thankful for about my proctor. So I said, Lord, can you show me something? And so the connecting piece was that she had been married for a very long time. You know, she always displayed in her cover life that good marriage. And so that became a, you know, I'm thankful that you had that good marriage, that you were a loving wife, that you were committed to and devoted to that relationship, and that you displayed that to us. And so, you know, I was able to make that a connecting piece between us, and just have that groundwork, you know, where we could share in something, or even, you know, her devotion to attend mass every single day. You know, it's like, I'm thankful that you go for mass and prayers every day. You know, thank you for showing that commitment to step into the Lord's house every day. You know, even though I knew she has some alternative motives when she does that, that starting point is just that base, finding something you can be thankful about, you know?
I think that is such an important one. Just that one thing every day for which you can be grateful or appreciative. And I
And you
think that
can use it as that word of encouragement for them. The majority of these people, they never, you know, they grew up like I did, where they never heard one good thing about themselves. They never had anybody saying, I appreciate this about you. So to move from that victim state to overcoming, it means that you're big enough to say, I forgive you, and now I want reconciliation in this relationship. And, I'm going to find things that will build you up and encourage you because nobody else ever has. And, I'm going to put the past aside. I'm not going to allow you to continue to abuse, but, let's start anew, and let's make this relationship what it can be, and that's the beauty in overcoming, is that, and to realize that you've got that choice, that, for me, one of the biggest freedom moments was when I realized I have the choice over my memories, over my flashbacks. I can choose what I share, and I can choose what I don't want to share. And, for that, there's real freedom. And, saying, even though I remember this, I don't have to share it. And I can choose to say, okay, that's one of my grace cards to you. Like, I like to, give grace cards or mercy cards, where it's like, this was the most horrific thing I ever went through, but my grace card to her is going to be that I never share that piece. That I say, I'm giving you that grace, that forever will be you, and I and God are forever the only witnesses of that. The world will never know that horror that you did. But there are other things that I am choosing, to hold you accountable to. And, so there's freedom in that.
Absolutely. I love that. I love the way that you put that, give them a grace card. I think that's very healing for you, I would imagine. And no doubt her, as you're saying, no one has ever told them good things about themselves. No one has ever spoken about the positive aspects of who they are and their beauty. Right. And everyone needs to know that. Everyone needs to hear and feel something wonderful about themselves, because that's the thing that gives us that encouragement to get up. So it makes us feel good. It gives us that nice, yummy feeling on the inside, Yeah. And it makes us feel worthy, that someone cares, someone sees that, which is so important. Yeah, I love that.
That you see the good in them, and, that you want that good to be what remains. Exactly. Say, I don't want to be afraid in this relationship. I don't want to be the victim in this relationship. I don't want to be the retaliator, or, the one taking vengeance or revenge. I just want to have a good relationship as best as we can have, that's safe for both of us. And that means defining, that no, I'm not going to keep the secrets. It's like, you abused me. This is, we both know you did these things, and not to be afraid to say that, you hurt me with these things that you did, but I choose to forgive you. I'm not going to allow it to continue, but it's not going to be a secret anymore, between us. We're bringing the elephant out in the room,
Exactly. That white Ellie must out. Yeah. Well, Jess, as usual, thank you so much. You've spent so much time with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Really appreciate your wisdom, your time, your energy, and your sharing. It's just so lovely to hear you speak about the side and, your kiddies and that part of your life as well, because at the end of the day, wow, you're this incredible human being that has been through so much and seen so much. And I'm sure your children are feeling very blessed to have you as their mama. Most definitely.
I hope so.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you again if you'd be happy to end off for us in prayer again after
Absolutely.
Soulutions as well. Okay.
Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day, and I lift up all those out there who have experienced severe trauma, abuse, even ritual abuse, Lord. And we ask that this would be a place of healing, that as they come, as they're drawn closer to you, Lord, that you would help us to work from that place of victimhood to that place of overcoming, that it would no longer be an impossibility, but that we would see that overcoming in our lives happen quickly, and that you would be our strength, that you would be our encouragement, that you would show each and every one of us how to navigate those struggles that we go through that are the consequences of the abuse that we have endured. And I trust, Lord, that you do have the solutions for each and every problem, that even if we're continuing to have situations within our homes or our life, that you are going to show us exactly how to navigate those situations and to bring reconciliation to the relationships within our families and within our communities. So we just praise you, we thank you, and we just proclaim that you are our healer. And I thank you that you've given this conversation today as a healing one, because that's your desire, not that we're in a place where we just treat the symptoms or manage our issues that are going on, but where we really experience healing through everything we've gone through in our lives. So I just ask that you would extend that healing and that it would go forth sevenfold, Lord, in our lives, and that you would restore to us all the years that the locusts have eaten, the years of devastation and destruction in our lives, that you would turn our future years into years of blessing, years filled with hope and joy and laughter. We ask for this in your holy name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Amen to that. Thank you so much, Jess. Again,
yes,
that was
thank you.
beautiful. And we look forward to having you back on Soulutions again.
Definitely.
Very soon. Yeah. Wonderful. So, guys and girls, thank you so much for catching us for a double zammy and a double wonderful whammy with Jessie tonight. So if you haven't already, please give us a like, a share, and a subscribe on this channel, Soulutions with Aquarius Rising Africa. We are on Telegram now as well. We've just got a Telegram account. So look forward to seeing you all very, very soon again. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much. Take good care. God bless you all, and we'll see. Well, hello again, everybody. Imagine that. We're back. This time on Soulutions with Aquarius Rising Africa and our gorgeous Jessie. Welcome back, Jess. How are you? It's been a very, very long time since we saw you.
Right? Just like 15 minutes, so long.
I know. And I'm still waiting for you to open that portal for me so I can go zooming through it. And just
right. I was working on that last night, Chantelle, but I think you slept through it, you know.
Dang, you're gonna have to give me some little wake-up calls before the time. I think I could wax it quite well through there. I like to maneuver through the portals and then bam, then I am with you. I'd be good at that,
right.
I think, definitely.
I think you would. You'd be really good at that.
I want to be the one. I want to be the portal guinea pig, so they can put me through the portals. I think that'd be really cool.
I don't think you want to be the portal guinea pig, you know, but
we'll have
you
to
might
have
end up with weird things. You know, I've seen those Star Trek shows where things go wrong.
And you end up in an abyss forever. No, I don't like that either. Anyway, so good to have you back on Soulutions, Jess. I know you've, as we know by now, been gallivanting all over the show. It's about time you stayed at home for a while, young lady, and attended to your interviewing duties, which you are now. I'm very happy to see, although next week you will be gone again. My word. Anyway, on our last Soulutions interview we did with you, we were speaking about being a child of parents who had themselves been in the system. And how does a child deal with that? Being a product of a product, if that makes sense. And then also, by the same token, you being a mom and having children, obviously, and especially with your family connections and bloodlines and stuff, very important, I guess, for you that you kept a massive eye on your kids. Now, I know that last time we had a really beautiful, candid, open interview with you, sharing a lot about your story, growing up with your proctor, and and also with your mom. So I'm wondering if there's anything just around that before we move on to the other stuff that you'd still maybe that you can share with us about being a child in a family like that. You there?
Yeah, there was a lot of ups and downs with that. There are things that I still want to share on that. One of them being, just the regular family dynamics. Because we came from a bloodline where the abuse was generational. We weren't just dealing with it with one abuser or one perpetrator in the family. There were many. And one of the, dynamics was that you had these cover lives where everybody had to pretend, we had to get together on a regular basis. We did a lot of large family activities, which included extended family. And so in that, you've got this whole dynamic of, that children are trained that they have to keep the silence even into adulthood, and they have to continue to pretend that things are good and that there is no indicators given to those outside of the family that anything is wrong. So that was one of the things, I began to address in my adult life is, it's really hard to spot these children that are trained in that posture cover life. And so, as teachers, as people in the community who need to be aware, as helpers or people who can support these kids, how do you know, what are the signs or indicators that a child may be not having things go well at home? And so, I'll use that. We know that in life, nothing is perfect, that every kid has a natural inclination to make mistakes or to choose to do what's naughty or wrong. So I think about, just natural kid stuff. I had, growing up, I did a lot of nanny stuff with kids that weren't in the system. And I can remember these two little twins that I had to work with, and they were so atrocious. Like, I'd get up in the morning and, be ready to care for them, but they would do this tag team thing where one would run and climb up on the bookshelf, and he would start tossing all the books off the shelf, and the bookshelf wasn't secured or nailed to the wall. So, the fear was that that bookshelf was going to fall on that kid as soon as those books were not holding it down any longer, right? But then the other one would run to the bathroom and would start, doing all sorts of stuff in the bathroom there. And I had to decide, like, which is the most important thing, which kid's going to get hurt first or cause the most damage first. And, ended up one day, they were just so bad. There was a high counter in their house. So I put him in that middle island counter and was like, we're baking a cake. And we baked a cake from scratch. We all got covered in flour. But we've got those natural things that kids do, or, they lie, they steal. They're just kids. But so, when you're dealing with kids that have grown up in the system, they're trained that their cover lives are absolutely perfect. There's nothing that they show on the outside that's an indicator that something is wrong. Many of them are chosen as top students. They'll get really good grades. They'll be involved in sports. They'll be involved in multiple extracurricular activities. They'll have their parents who come and show up and are present at their activities. So it will seem like there's a lot of high family involvement in these situations. But then, you'll start to notice things that are a little off. For a lot of the hierarchy girls, one of the few things that they can control is their body and their weight. So a lot of them will get into things like anorexia, bulimia, where they purposely will do damage, the damage that they can do to their body. Many of those kids become cutters, but they do it in spots where, the normal person isn't going to see things happening. So these are things we start to watch for, for the older children. For the younger ones, one of the other major indicators will be the extreme nightmares or night terrors or night paralysis. So I encourage, adults that if you're in those support activities or support roles, like a teacher, a pastor, if you have a child that's coming up to you claiming strange things, take the time to stop and ask questions, or even those whose lives look perfect, take the time to really make them pause and say, how was your night? How are you sleeping? If they mention that they have nightmares, explore that more. Sometimes those nightmares are memories or flashbacks that are coming back that they don't have conscious memory of. So pay attention, or, sometimes the kids will start to lose time. Like they'll space out and they lose, whole blocks of time. Yeah. And, so like if you're talking to your child saying, how was your day at school? Don't just take oh, it was good. Explore that further. What was good about it? What did you do today? If they can't remember, there's a problem. That's an indicator that something, it may not be satanic ritual abuse, but if it's a continued pattern, that's an indicator that something is wrong, because children should be able to remember everything that they did in a day, or the generalities of it. They may not remember every single detail of it, but they should be able to tell you day to day what they've done. So, it's important. I think that was one of the things that I learned, is that, if we want to break the abuse cycles, for all of us who have lived through those things, there are certain things we've learned to, protect ourselves from those abuse cycles. And it's that knowledge that we need to share with others so that they can be aware and, utilize that to stop continued abuse for children that may be experiencing it in our communities. So
what would you say to, and it's difficult to really, I understand, as a child, because there won't be many children watching this. But so I'm asking a question really on behalf of maybe older teenagers or adults who were kids of parents who've been in the system. And actually, this is a two-layered question again. We've often heard that not all of the kids are taken into the system. So let's say, for example, you might have 3 kids in the family or whatever, and maybe one is taken in or 2, but the other one isn't. Okay.
Right.
So I would imagine if you're the child that's not taken into the system, you have no idea whatsoever that the others are in the system, right?
Right.
I would imagine there's no indication given. So let's say, what would you say to people who have that occur in their families, like where it's already so split? Well, let's start with that. What would you say if, like, let's say people are split? You were the one that, let's say, had the violence and the abuse perpetuated on you. Your siblings have no idea about that, or they're in denial, or they've been hauled back in and programmed. How would you share with people to deal with that kind of isolation?
Yeah, I encourage even, as teenagers, like in my family, it was really difficult because usually as kids, when we got to hang out together, like at family events and stuff, we usually never got any alone time in the home. But if we were outside, running, playing tag, playing hide and seek, like that's where we would get those few little moments. But I can remember, a moment like with one of my cousins where, we were at, I'll just say it was, our great aunt who was one of the most evil mothers. And we were at her home and we found ourselves in a room alone together. And the door was closed, which was very odd. Like usually that wouldn't happen. And I remember she looked at me and she said, well, that great aunt, she's a witch. She's a black witch. And that was the first time we had ever acknowledged to each other that we knew, she was a black witch. And I said, yeah, I said, she is. And I said, how do you know that? And, that's when we started sharing some of our experiences together that we consciously remembered. And so, it is interesting, like even later than in adult years, what I appreciated is, I did have that split in the family where some experienced abuse, some did not. And, there's been moments where, me and my siblings will talk about the things that we remembered, and then the one who hasn't had that experience, there's more complications that go forward because you want to warn, you want to say, hey, don't leave your children alone with these particular family members. But, those siblings were kind of also smart because they see our natural body language. So even at family events, they would notice that, I was very mindful of my children, that I wouldn't allow them to go off with just anybody. I always was there present with them, and they would start to say, how come that's not okay with you? Like, how come you don't let that family member alone with your children? And that's when I would start to share, some of the information. And at first it's hard to hear, But as you are truthful about those things, those people say, I have seen some stuff that has made me feel unsafe with that person. And the truth, always comes to the forefront, no matter how good people's lives are. Children are the best judge of character. So, my kids around certain people, they would start screaming their little heads off, and they did not want to go to those individuals. They didn't want to be held by them. So part of it is, when you see stuff like that happening, pay attention, listen to your children. Even if you believe that person is a good person, at least take the time to really pray and ask the Lord to show you, where really is this person's heart? Is this family member bad? Is there something that they're in that my child can sense, that my child is having a reaction to, that I need to pay attention to?
Yeah.
But the other thing is, they'll do the scapegoating, because the children that are not selected, they want them to feel down about themselves. They want them to feel unloved, to feel like they're out of place. And so, some of the things that would happen in our lives was that, we would go to these huge family events, and because there were so many family members, like around Christmas time, we would do like a gift exchange. So instead of bringing gifts for everybody, you'd have a one of the family members' names, and you'd have to buy that person a gift. So every year, we'd show up, and me and one of my siblings would be left out. And the story was just always that we were forgotten. Like, oh, we forgot again, and, this poor kid is like, how come I'm always forgotten? Like, why didn't I get a gift? And so we would endure that over and over again every year. And there would just be that, that indirect scapegoat feeling that would go on. Or, there would be comments that would be said about, well, that little guy is a bully, he doesn't deserve anything. And, they would cause the scapegoating through their little comments that, would affect the feelings and the emotions of the children. And, for some of my cousins, I saw that happening, where the women in the group would make comments about their weight. Like, they could be beautiful, thin, trim girls. And they would, from some of the family members, they would get comments like, you're too thin, you need to eat. And then the other family members would make comments on, well, no wonder, like, no boys are interested in you, you're too fat, and they would create those insecurities in body image, or even tease about, in our families, there was always one child that completely looked different than the others. Like me and the majority of my siblings were towhead blondies. But then we had one sibling that had dark hair. And, and they would tease that, she must have been adopted or things like that, So, but she would also be treated more special by others as well, because she was different than the rest of us. So it gets interesting that you get these dynamics that are going on with that scapegoating. And, most of the time as a kid, even into your adult years, you have no idea. You're like, why do people in my family treat me this way? Like, you know, and then they'll have diverse reactions to, you know, children like me who, you know, I was very strong-willed against that abuse. Um, you know, when we were at family events, I would be gathering all the kids together, making sure we were playing games so that none of the kids were able to be alone with anybody, and that would make them mad, you know? And
Yeah.
I would do things to call back, you know, if they tried to take one of the kids and said, "Oh, you know, like," I mean, it was always a good story, like, "Oh, let's go make chocolate chip cookies for everybody." And it would be like, "Ah, none of us kids want chocolate chip cookies. Like, we all want to play. Let's come back and play with us. You know, we need the extra person." Or it'd be,
Yeah.
"Oh, well, let's all go make cookies." You know, they hated that one too.
Yeah.
And so I would try to find ways to keep us together so that they couldn't split up or separate, you know.
Yeah. Your family. I'm interested, and obviously, I understand your siblings are completely what's happened in their lives is completely confidential and their
Right.
story. But just I'm just interested because from what I'm hearing you say, some of them were in the system, were taken in, and others not.
Right.
So in your particular instance, the ones that weren't taken in, that were kind of just living the cover life, are they aware of what's happened with you and, let's say, your other siblings and maybe even your other cousins and stuff? Are they aware what even exists in your family at this point in time in your lives? Do they know?
Some of them, yes. Not all, but some of them are very aware. Yeah.
So I'm interested, like, to also understand just between you and your siblings when it comes to your own personal healing as siblings. Do you ever discuss this stuff with each other? Do you sit down as sibs and talk about this, speak about what went down, what the other one experienced or nothing? You know, the one that, for example, that would have experienced nothing, how does that affect them? How do they feel about it? How does that affect your relationship? Does that divide your family? I'd be, you know, stuff like that. That's interesting to me.
Yeah, I'm really blessed. You know, I've got the majority of individuals are very supportive. I'll say, you know, closer in relationship to me are very supportive. They, you know, they've known because I've never lied. You know, I've shared some of this stuff from the time we were little. Um, you know, I would put comments out there like I couldn't share the full extent of things, but I would say, you know, don't be alone with that person. Um, you know, we kind of knew, like with my proctor, there were things that abuses that she did across the board. Um, you know, so they went through things like where she was pinching them also, you know, under the arms or things like that. You know, they also witnessed some of the alcoholism that was involved in the family. So, you know, there were some things that were not hidden that kind of were the excuses for behavior at times. Um, but then, you know, there were moments. So, you know, the first time that several of us got to really talk about some of the things were, you know, when we began speaking about certain locations. And it was like, oh, like, you know, you've seen that wall with all the handprints too, and you've been
Yeah.
to that location where it's at. And that's even when my mom, the first time that she overheard us talking of that, you know, it had always been in her dreams and she would have nightmares about it. So when she heard us describing that place, you know, it made her pause where she was like, am I talking in my sleep? Are you guys repeating back things that I've said in my sleep? And it's like, no, that's a real place. And she was like, it is a real place, you know, do you know where it's at? And it's like, yeah, you know, here's the location. And so, um, you know, those conversations, you know, they got deeper throughout the years in the moments, you know, where it's like, you know, we even got to the point of, you know, why did we have to go through certain things that we went through? You know, was it just training for positions? Was it more? What, you know, what were the motives behind it? Um, you know, so I probably can't say more than that, but yes, we have gotten to speak on some of those things and question, you know, process. Um, you know, and everybody's in different places in their journey or their walk. Um, you know, there were you know, some of my family members that went through some of those things with me early on at a young age. You know, they don't have memories of those things, like they don't have memories of their childhood at all. And so for them, you know, some of it just seems so surreal, and, you know, they question, you know, but still, you know, I felt it was my responsibility to put the warnings out there. You know, don't leave your children alone with these people. Um, you know, you need to protect them and guard them. And, you know, some have heeded those warnings, others have not. Um, you know, so that's how I've tried to stop the abuse cycle, but I've seen in some ways, you know, it still has been allowed to continue.
So, with the family knowing what they know, let's say about your proctor, who's, from what I'm hearing, the matriarch of the family, right? Would that
Right.
be right? So, how do they feel about that? Do they feel protective over her? Do they just want to annihilate her? How does the family as a whole feel about her? And because I'm sure what she's perpetuated on you is probably not unique to you. Maybe you would have, because of your position, had it worst of the lot type thing in the family. But how does the rest of the family actually feel about her? And does anyone want to do anything about it? I mean, I would love to talk at a later stage about the forgiveness and everything. Again, I know we've touched on that in the past, but I think that would be something very important to work with here. But just interesting, just the general consensus about how the family feels about it. And I mean, you must have interesting family get-togethers, right? When all of this has gone down and some know, others don't know, you know, there's obviously some kind of a camaraderie between you and your siblings and stuff like that. Everyone is supportive of that. Yet there she is, having done these things. Are they scared of her? Are they wary of her? Do they run away from her? Do the kids hide behind their heads when she arrives?
I think it's a mix of all of that. You get all of those dynamics, you know. Yeah, it does get very interesting. And I think, you know, that's the continued, I guess we'll say, cover life, where people, you know, they don't know how to address it. They don't know how to fix the issue or necessarily even stop the abuse. And, you know, it's so ingrained in them. You know, she, even as we were kids, would use the term good people. You know, good people don't tell the family secrets. Good people don't air the family's dirty laundry. You know, so anything that's not that good, uplifting cover life is considered dirty laundry. And, you know, God forbid you tell anybody, especially outside of the family, and then, you know, you're going to have this woman who is high level witchcraft do horrible things to you, torment you in your sleep and in the night. You know, I mean, they all know if you break the silence, you better be prepared, because, you know, she's coming in the middle of the night. And so nobody wants to put up with that or put up with her in that mode. So you get this almost equipping happening where everybody knows where the line is drawn. You know, they know what to say, what to do to keep that peace in the family so that she's not going after anybody. You know, and God forbid, you know, they even fear and help, you know, there's almost like this help to control others in the family who may go forward. You know, anybody who tried to step out of line, you immediately have the entire family, you know, making comments suggesting that that definitely is not what you want to do. And so, you know, then if you continue to go forward, they start the crazy making game. Well, that person's, you know, they're just lying. They, you know, they have some mental health issues. They're crazy. They've always been crazy since they were a kid. You know, that's the line that comes out. But yet it's like, did y'all forget that I was the kid that would repeat back word for word, even the things I wasn't supposed to repeat back? And how many times did even my proctor say, "My, you have a memory like an elephant"? That was a cut. It wasn't a compliment. You know, she was telling me that I was saying too much out loud and I needed to keep my mouth shut. And you know, so they start those crazy making games and everybody goes along with it because they're afraid.
Gaslighting. Yeah.
Yeah, they're afraid to put up with the hell that one has to go through to break that silence. And, you know, what's neat now, though, is that I think as more and more people are coming forward and, you know, things have gotten to a place where there's no more covering up. You know, there's no more covering up. There's too many implications. There's too many evidences and proofs, and those have been brought forward. And so there's no more hiding from those truths. And, you know, that's the biggest thing, you know, because so many survivors go through those stages where the people in their lives tell them they're crazy or they've got mental health issues. They even get them involved sometimes with psychiatrists or other mental health workers who give them a label. And they fall under the belief that there is something wrong with them. And I want to bring out the truth in that. You know, what I tell those individuals is, you never were crazy. The truth is that you were the only person in your family bold enough to state the truth. And so throw away those labels. It's not saying that we, you know, there may be some who still have issues because there is damage that's caused, even at a mental and emotional level, at a spiritual level. All of us who have been through that dark, you know, I'll just call it a dark ringer, you know, there's things that are done. And that damage is done. And, you know, so sometimes, you know, medication, sometimes seeing a counselor, sometimes going through deliverance, all those things can be very necessary in that healing process. So don't be afraid to go through that healing process, whatever it is that you need. But at the same time, don't take labels that are slapped on you. You know, don't be afraid to say, I'm not crazy. I wasn't having hallucinations. You know, I was seeing in the spirit world. I was getting attacked. I was experiencing a spiritual attack. And, the solution isn't medication to cover up that attack. The solution is rebuking those spirits.
Exactly.
Or rebuking those people who are astral projecting and attacking you. And so
absolutely.
that's what, I encourage people to look at all those things and not be afraid to speak forth the truth, and not be, so many people will come against you that there's days where it's really hard to continue to go forward. And we have to not be afraid. The biggest fear and the biggest threat is that, they say they'll take your life or the lives of those you love the most. And those who've gone through the ringer know that it's not going to be a quick, easy death, that they're going to do things that will make it long, torturous, make you regret that you're coming forward. But we have to stand even firmer, and not allow the enemy to continue.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a question for you though. So you
got that smile, Chantelle, so I know it's going to be a good question. One I probably can't answer. Go ahead.
I'm looking at the look on your face because I know you recognize the look on mine.
Right.
So your grandma had 4 sisters, and together they were the 5 mothers of darkness, right? Now I'm very curious. Did you ever see them have arguments? And what did they do? Were they like flying around on their brooms? How were they arguing with each other? I mean, were they like throwing witchy bombs?
Oh, they did.
At
times. Yeah, at times they did.
Are you serious? They really actually did. You being serious?
Yeah, there were some times the fireballs were going. They would, honestly, like, it's this weird dynamic. They're very devoted to each other, but at the same time, they absolutely hate each other. And so it's like it shifts from moment to moment. Like they could be, the funniest parts, I think, were, when at night, when everybody had to be meeting with Lucifer, and they would argue over, power, authority, jurisdiction, argue for certain rights over certain individuals, especially if that individual was displaying, what they considered more power. And, if they had somebody who was weaker in their magic circles, and all of a sudden somebody comes along that's more powerful, like they would be so quick to give somebody the boot and put in that new person who had more power, and they would all fight over it. And they would cackle. Like I can't even replicate the cackle, but they would take glee in the more harm that it caused people. They would be joyful and glee in that and be cackling. And the power battles, they would stand in each other's spaces. So you had I didn't get to experience we'll call them the old guard, so some of my grandmothers, or I'll just say my proctor's relatives, they were part of that original group of mothers before my proctor took her position. And with those, this really is where The Wizard of Oz, that movie, is based off of that group of 4 women. And they leave the 5th one out. And so, the one who had the ruby slippers, she was just this nasty little, if you met her in her cover life, she probably seemed very much like a hotty-toity or hoity-toity Southern girl. you know, but it was like she was so picky. Like she would have this rod, Astaroth pole or scepter, you could call it, that she would always walk with. And so when I had to go be presented before her, like she wanted your feet in a certain position. And I never would stand like with both my feet right next to each other. I always would pull that, you know, that right leg back. And she would sit there and hit the back of my heels with that scepter, and she would hit it hard. And she would hit my heel until I would bring my feet together. But by the time she turned around and was sitting on her little throne again, that foot would be slipped back and she'd be pissed. And, you know, some of these matters they would bring before the World Council because, you know, they considered it disrespectful and rude. You know, my proctor never stood up for me in any of those fights. The person who stood up for me was Lori Cabot-Kent. And Lori was somebody that, you know, she definitely would obey. She did her position well, according to the system. But she was somebody that fully, you know, embraced and taught all of her students that, you know, you be who you are, and that's what makes you beautiful, is that you are just who you are. So she really fought for that for me. Like, you know, there were so many individuals who wanted to dictate, you know, certain things that I could do or wouldn't do. They purposely put me with all of the dark black witches, you know, and those mothers, because that's what they wanted. They wanted that evil in my heart, and they would do everything within their means to draw that evil out, even to the point of, you know, shooting me up with adrenochrome and putting me in situations where there was no way out except for to do the evil that they told you had to do. And, you know, so even through that, we found the Lord would provide ways. The Lord would make ways out of those situations for us that were outside of their control. You know, there were times that, yes, they, you know, I didn't call it flying, they levitated. You know, there were times that they levitated. There were times that they came out of nowhere levitating to attack you. You know, I was pinned to walls multiple times. You know, I would be dragged out of my bed in the middle of the night. You know, I never experienced, you know, them levitating through a city or anything in the middle of the night, but, you know,
on their brooms in the full moon.
Yeah, for longer distances, usually they would, you know, use spiritual gates for transportation or things. You know, I was trying to think of, so some of the best ones, like I would try to sometimes set up scenarios that would best them in these situations, you know, so they couldn't do what they were plotting or planning to do. And yeah, they're just, I don't know how to even go into some of that stuff, but yeah, they would fight, they would attack each other, they would pull each other's hair out. It would be an all-out girls fight at moments. You know, the nails, the claws are coming out, and you know, you were just stuck getting the attack, however that came. The thing I hated the most is they would have these, you know, because of their cover life, they would always, you know, they would sew up dresses or things that got ripped, but that was their excuse, that they always would have a needle somewhere hidden in their dress, or multiple needles. You know, usually it would be up on the collars or in the hem of their dress. And you never knew when they were pulling that sucker out if there was poison on it or a paralyzer. they like to use the paralyzers, and then you're stuck. Like, you can't move, you're fully conscious, but there's nothing you can do. And, so it's like I always felt like I had to keep my distance, but I'd be stuck right in the middle of them. And I'd be like, consciously aware of where is every hand, where are their feet, it was like you're watching the ground, because some of them would sprinkle poison as they're walking because everybody's barefoot. So then you're going to be getting issues where you're going to be throwing up and vomiting and having stomach cramps and diarrhea the rest of the day. And here's the funny thing. They would do these things, setting each other up because they'd be mad at each other. So they'd give each other diarrhea and bad stomach cramps through different, whatever they threw on the ground, right? They got soaked up through your bare feet. You'd be sick as a dog, and then you'd have them coming over. Oh, I'm here to take care of you. I made you a pot of chicken noodle soup. I will nurse and tend to you. And I'd be sitting there like, I just, want to be alone. Like, leave me alone. Like, it's like, what do you put in the soup?
I ain't touching that soup. No,
it would be a great offense. Like, if you didn't accept the soup, you'd offend them more, and then you had worse stuff coming next.
So you had no choice.
Right? So it's like, it was like this weird dynamic where they care for each other and, at the same time, absolutely hated each other.
I definitely think in one of our follow-up interviews, I would like just to talk about them, each one of them, and all their antics, the mothers of darkness.
All their antics, yeah. We'll see if we can get into that. These were the old guard mothers, but yeah, they were interesting. And that old guard. So one of the, my proctor's older sisters was part of that older guard, and she's the one that Cisco Wheeler mentions in her book. I think it's the Total Mind Control Program. She talks about the mother that got out in the 70s. And so she did. One of the mothers got out, and they allowed her to completely, remain. Like, she was still expected to come to family events. She had to keep that cover life to stay alive. But it was actually her husband was the one at the family reunions who had said to me, when they would bring the pies in that had the drops of poison in them, he's the one who said to me, what's not poisoned? The olives. So her husband had been a high-level Mason, and he got out as well. And so when we were at these family reunions together, they knew that I had been chosen, and all that was happening to me. And in that, within their ability, they would help me find ways to get through some of those moments. So that is very interesting.
Wow. Amazing how God sends his angels even in those types of moments, Yeah. Wow.
Right.
Well, I could definitely carry on this conversation for another 4 hours, but I know that you're on a very tight schedule right now. But we're definitely going to be talking about, we call it a day in the life of the mothers or something. We can hear all about who they are, what they do, how they like to do things. We'll get to know the mothers as well. I think that's quite cool. Cheers. Thank you so much for a double dose with us here at Aquarius Rising Africa today on our Soulutions channel. And to those of you who haven't given us a like, a share, and a subscribe yet, please do. We're growing both our channels again. Had to start from afresh, which is always a very, very good thing. And we're happy to be doing it. So Jessie, beautiful Jessie, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I know you've just prayed for us before, but I think never, I mean, there's never too much prayer. So maybe you want to end off for us again, yeah, please.
Yeah. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time to come together. And I thank you that in all things, your desire for us is to be whole and complete. And you desire to give us that healing that we need. So I just pray for everybody out there today who's listening, whatever the trauma, whatever the abuse, whatever the deep pain that they carry is, I ask that you would speak to that pain today, that you would help them to begin to process and understand not only what they went through, but even the people who may have caused that pain and that hurt. And I ask that you would bring them to a place where they would be able to forgive and they would be able to overcome. They'd be able to see how to address that abuse that they experienced or address that pain, and that you would bring life out of those areas where they have had trauma and crisis and suffering. I thank you, Lord, that all those things that cause our lives to feel like we've had nothing but death and destruction, that your desire really is to bring life out of those moments. And so I ask that you would release to us that life. For every child out there that's suffering, Lord, release that life. And we ask also for the release of the joy, the laughter, the forgiveness, and above all, Lord, I ask that we would be able to see and experience beauty, and that all the years that have been stolen from us, that you would restore those years sevenfold, Lord. We thank you and praise you. In your powerful name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, beautiful
All right.
Jessie.
Thank you.
Thank you for our double dose. And guys and girls, thank you so, so much for watching us. And I hope you enjoyed our double dose with Jessie. And we certainly did. So God bless you all. Take good care of yourselves. And we will see you very, very, very